Thank you very much, Bob, for such a thought-provoking lecture, always clear and in an eloquent style. We thought that to dedicate the rest of the time to a conversation. Yes. And the first thing I want to ask is, I believe you're not just a fascinated analyst, Kleinian analyst, loyal to the Kleinian theory, but you also like to make revisions in Kleinian theory. And I think the central revision of yours is what you talked about in your paper about the countertransference, because it seems to be very central to your writings. And the countertransference you are interested in seems very different from Klein's perception of countertransference, which he wrote, "I have never found that countertransference has helped me to understand my patient better. If I may put it like this, I have found that it helped me to understand myself better." Mm-hmm. So I believe there is an interesting debate within the Kleinian movement, and that you have sort of shifted from that traditional thought. You also told me in personal communication that you were never part of the hardcore Kleinian British psychoanalyst from London. So maybe that's part of the answer.
Well, yes, I'm pretty much committed to the core ideas of the Klein, of what Klein developed in her work. But I agree with you that she was very suspicious of countertransference, as, of course, analysts had been from the very beginning, when, Jung, the great supporter of Freud at the beginning, lost it, and he had some kind of sexual relationship with one of his patients, Sabina Spielreich. And of course, Ferenczi also had a curious situation with a patient of his, where he was tempted to marry the patient, but on the other hand, he wondered about marrying the patient's mother. And eventually he married the patient's mother. But again, this is a complex, bewildering kind of outcome of the engagement with, between a patient and an analyst. And of course, there is the, somebody was mentioning it, the problem with Anna O. And the false pregnancy that she fantasized that she'd had with her analyst, the first analyst, Breuer. So there's a long history of being suspicious of the countertransference, and Klein entered psychoanalysis in the around 1917, 18, the big break with Jung, and pretty much a conformist view that was led by Freud to keep psychoanalysis in the exact system that Freud decided. I think Klein was pretty committed to that, partly because at the time that she became an analyst, if you weren't completely in line, you were in danger of being pushed out, like Adler and Jung and Rank, and Ferenczi was never pushed out exactly, but there was a disharmony, wasn't there? There was a divergence between Freud and Ferenczi during the 1920s. Klein, as you know, was first of all in analysis with Ferenczi, and she must have known about this and the risk. You've got to be there and use the terminology and the ideas that are prescribed from the sort of biblical Freudian texts. So I think she had grown up at a time when you had to be pretty conformist, and even knew Ferenczi, for instance, who had suffered from diverging from Freud. I think, having said that as a bit of an excuse for Klein, I think she didn't get it, really. You quote her saying that she learned more about herself from the countertransference than she learned about the patient. And I think the step on from that, which analysts, at least in the British school, have, the step on that they have taken is, yes, you learn something about yourself because your patient brings it to life. The patient projects into you, projection being an important Kleinian concept, projects into you, but into a specific part of you, a part of you that feels this, or forgets that, or is defensive in this way, or represses that, or splits this off, or whatever. It's a precise view of the defensiveness and the particular anxiety which is defended against. That's what Klein is saying. You learn about yourself, yes, but also what she could have gone on to was to say, you don't only learn about yourself, but you learn about what it is your patient wants to disturb in you, and therefore you have another way of understanding what's going on in the patient's mind.
But still, it's all about the patient putting feelings of his in you, projecting feelings. But what about the emotional experience of the analyst himself, his own subjectivity?
Yes, well, I agree. The example I gave from Britten and Steiner can be used to sort of illustrate that, because what the patient was reacting to was something about the analyst's need to put the patient into a straitjacket of theory, which would then relieve the analyst. There is a process that goes the other way. And, patients come and see us every day of the week. They get to know a good deal about us, not just what's around in our consulting room, which is often very personal, but also they get a feel of how we interact to this and that and the next thing. So patients know an awful lot about us. And I think that there is an important addition to this, which it's crystallized. I don't think it really belongs, first of all, but it was crystallized by John Steiner, one of the people who wrote this paper I quoted from. It's in another paper, where he talks about two kinds of interpretation. One is the interpretation of what's going on in the patient's mind. The other is to interpret what the patient thinks is going on in the analyst's mind. And Steiner invented a couple of terms. One was patient-centered interpretation, and the other was analyst-centered interpretation. The difference that Kleinians would have with a lot of other people, perhaps, a lot of other analysts, is that Kleinians would not confirm or disconfirm the patient's perceptions of the analyst's mind. They, Kleinian would interpret what the patient thought about the analyst's mind and try to find the relevance of what the patient was seeing there.
But they will not say if he's right or wrong.
An analyst won't say he's right or wrong in that delicate sort of situation. Yes, that's right. Paula Hyman, who is a central person in the development of the idea of countertransference. She wasn't the first person. There was a lot of discussion of countertransference going on from the late 30s, really, but her 1950 paper, as she presented it in 1949, is a key paper about this use of countertransference as a second way of gaining some understanding of the patient's mind. Paula Hyman got a bit worried about this because she wrote another paper 10 years later in 1960 saying actually she found it a bit awkward because sometimes analysts would just use only their countertransference and say to themselves, oh, I felt that must be the patient. When clearly analysts do have their own problems and they get stirred up, like the uncertainty that we all feel, like irritation we feel sometimes. We all have these kinds of reactions, and just to say, oh, that's the patient, is unrealistic. She also says, in that paper, or in another paper, she says, it's not fair to tell a patient that you've got it right or you've got it wrong. A patient comes to an analysis for the analyst to pay full attention to the patient. It's unfair to get the patient thinking about the analyst's mind and what he's done wrong.
Yes, but I'm thinking about the patient. He says things to the therapist, and the therapist never tells him if he or she is right or wrong. I'm thinking about the experience of the patient not knowing if he's right or wrong and lacks a sort of an emotional validity to his own feeling and his own attributions. What do you think of that?
Well, it depends what you mean by emotional validity. And yes, some patients, but not all, excuse me. Oh, sorry. Some patients, but not all, will think of their analysts as being very omnipotent and being know-all and being unable to admit that they are wrong, make mistakes, and so on. That's true. But that would be an interpretation to make, that the patient has an image in their mind of some object, some other, that is omnipotent and cannot admit to mistakes. Now, the analyst would then say, where does that come from? He sees that in me, but does that just come from me, or is that the patient's way of interpreting something based on the patient's own experience? Kleinians have a view that we live in two worlds of others, two worlds of objects, as they're unfortunately called. One is a set of objects inside us which have a particular pattern, a narrative of relationships with each other in our mind, and which act as kind of templates, patterns that we put on the world outside. And I think the point would be that if what the patient sees in the analyst is most likely to come from one of those templates or patterns, what the Kleinians call them unconscious fantasies, which are then seen in the world around. And I was just thinking about political situations and how we see enemies based on internal reality as much as external reality. The analyst would want to know if that understanding of the patient's perception is correct, if there's some omnipotent object that the patient has in mind that can't admit mistakes. If it becomes clear what the patient's templates, patterns, unconscious fantasies are, and the analyst has got that wrong too, the analyst might say, look, I made a mistake. Oh, I'm sorry. The analyst might make a mistake, but the analyst's first and foremost job is to try to understand what is going on inside the patient's mind and how that is coloring the external situation with the objects outside the patient.
Yes, but that's the Kleinian theory. But how exactly, back to your point, how do you make from it living moments? How do you avoid mechanical interpretations if it's just looking into his mind and telling him what's on his mind, and interpreting the symbolic content of what he says? How do you make it alive?
Well, I tried to indicate. Oh, this is not working. There. Yes. Analysts are not very good technicians, I think, and we're all troubled with these.
Can you put it in your hand, maybe?
Okay. I'm sorry if I hadn't been very audible. I'll try to get it near my mouth without swallowing it. Wait. Yes. How do you get alive moments? Well, I'm saying in this paper, but also it's elaborated much more in the previous publication of mine. It's called Research on the Couch. But it's how you get valid research material out of the clinical process. And I'm saying you can get a good idea of what sort of interpretation might touch or tally with something in the patient, going back to Freud's idea, by a sort of triangulation method, by two different perspectives. If two perspectives point to the same thing, then you can have some confidence that it's worth making an interpretation. And if you get the theoretical view of the material and it doesn't correspond to countertransfers, probably better not to make an interpretation. So I'm saying there are two perspectives here. One is the material that is being presented in the session. What is the narrative between what sort of objects is the patient conveying in the material? And the other perspective is the kind of experienced, emotional role-playing that the analyst feels in an intuitive way, actually in the session with the patient. So you get two perspectives, and if there's an overlap of that, then it's worth making an interpretation. That's the first step. The second step is what kind of response do you get? If you're given a mechanical interpretation, you get a mechanical response, or in the case of my interpretation, he just went to sleep.
Snoring.
Snoring, yes. That's an indication you've got it very wrong. Process is important. Processes is as important as content, and it's the process particularly of the material the patient gives, its associations, the interpretation which the analyst thinks up, as I suggest from these two perspectives, and then vitally, what sort of change occurs in the connection between the analyst and the patient. Very often none. And if there's no process after the interpretation, you go back to square one and start thinking about what interpretation you might make, and you start thinking about what sort of interpretations you make with a patient, with this patient, who's got an analyst who gets it wrong. As in the example of Britton and Steiner, where what you interpret is about the analyst who got it wrong. He was in the wrong mental place for the patient. So I'm saying there are these various steps that you can take to unpick this idea of Freud's tally principle. Does that make it any clearer?
It's very clear, but it sounds very systematic, very scientific. What about those moments that you don't know? You just don't know. You don't have any idea. You avoid using theory just to be with this not knowing feeling in order to be open to the experience. Like Bjorn often recommends.
Yes.
Where does that fit in?
Well, first and foremost, you take your own feeling of not knowing where you are, feeling lost or whatever. It's not always the case, but it's very often the case that this is something that you share with the patient. After all, patients come to an analysis. God, why would a patient come to an analysis in the first place? Pay all that money, spend all that time, and listen to all sorts of interpretations which cause them pain and suffering. God, it's crazy to go into analysis, isn't it? But it isn't. The important thing I'm saying, first of all, is to consider how much is the patient trying to convey in this second route, this intuitive way, how much are they trying to convey their desperation, that they don't know where they are, and that if one can forget the material, as it were, and make an interpretation about how the patient feels lost with himself, to not know what to do with himself. Now, you may be wrong about that. And of course, I suspect most of our interpretations are wrong. Mostly in the literature, we all write up those cases where we get everything pretty much right, don't we? But actually, I suspect that we get pretty much wrong a lot of the time, and that we need to be a bit more humble about what we write. But I'm saying that would be my first thought if I'm feeling, as in a piece of material that I brought with my patient who went to sleep, and I felt irritated that I was doing all this hard work and he was just going to sleep. The interpretation in that respect was turned around. I made the interpretation that he was like this unreliable colleague working on a project, whereas it was the other way around, it seemed, that I was the unreliable colleague, that he couldn't get to understand him properly. And when I made that second interpretation, he didn't go to sleep. and gave interesting material about two insects buzzing together, which I thought, don't know what you thought, was it preposterous? But I thought was a disguised, dreamlike expression of two minds coming together and trying to do a project together. So when I revised my interpretation to make it the other way around, I got something from the patient that sounded like he understood a cooperative moment, which I would call an alive moment. That there was a connection between us, which was some sort of understanding, not in words, but in that mysterious unconscious to unconscious communication that Freud talked about early on, didn't he? Very early on, 1912 or something.
I see that you did not mention projective identification in the whole process of living moments, and I wonder if that's something that you of course you work with, but what is the place in living moments of the projective identification? Does it have to come through the living moment, through projective identification?
Well, simple answer is yes, but projective identification is just a word, two words really, but and it can mean all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But
you need to
Just take the microphone in your hand, then, because you're talking to him.
yes, okay, everybody, yes. All right. Yes, I was saying that in the word you can use the word projective identification. I think it's an overused term, which is, and a lot of people mean different things by it. So when I am saying that one of the experiences that the patients can induce in you is the kind of desperation of feeling lost that the patient feels, that's what would be called a projective identification, or one form of it. It's not a psychotic form of projective identification, which is what Melanie Klein originally described. It is much more what her followers were discussing in the 1950s, including Bion in the late 1950s. But yes, you can call it projective identification, but I tend to steer clear of that term because it means too many things to too many different people, and there's a kind of tendency for people to say, oh, you're a Kleinian, you just talk about projective identification, as if they can get rid of the point that I'm trying to make.
Yes. I want to ask you something about the Kleinian theory and the Kleinian theory, how it describes the human infant. It seems that many people think that how Klein described the infant with these horrible fantasies is not the infant, the cute baby that they know about. And I want to ask you, do you think that these stages, the depressive stage, the schizoparanoid stage, is also position, of course not stage, position. Is that like infants really think and fantasize, or you more use it as a metaphor to understand adult patients?
Yes, well, nobody can know what an infant actually feels or sees or thinks or hears, even though every single one of us has been an infant that has had infantile experiences. The argument that Klein would say, and she did it on the basis of analyzing with her play technique children of in their third year of life. That's not early infancy, of course. What Klein would say was, actually, we don't develop on from the infant and leave the infant behind. We have an infant all the time inside us, and we are all the time struggling with roughly two sets of characteristic feelings and objects and anxieties and defenses. These go on all our lives, and we can all fit into a paranoid schizoid position. How would you run a war without getting your soldiers into a paranoid belief that they've got to kill before they're going to be killed? We get to these very primitive states of mind. And, the point is that we can, most of us, most of the time, manage that infantile side of ourselves by devoting it towards more mature ends, something like Freud called sublimation, although Klein preferred her term reparation. But the idea would be that what Klein saw as an infant is something one can see at any age. It becomes expressed in a modified form as we get older, and we can move back to more infantile moments, like killing the enemy before the enemy kills me kind of state of mind. So that is, I think you're saying, is that just a metaphor? I think Kleinians would say it's not a metaphor. I think Freud would say that his view of infantile experience is not a metaphor. I think Winnicott would say it's not a metaphor. And each of the schools use a different model of what an infant is doing, feeling, and uses that to attempt to understand what's happening as an adult right through life.
Yes, we are almost at the end of the session. I have just two more questions to ask you. One is that, yes, the political situation in Israel here is very stormy now. And we have a debate in our institute, how should we react as analysts to this debate? And I wonder whether psychoanalytic ideas lead to any particular form of political action, or we're just like any other profession.
I think psychoanalysis is like any other profession.
I think they can't hear you.
I think psychoanalysis is like any other profession. It's not omnipotent and it can't cure the ills of the world. We can comment on it.
We can what?
Comment on it, but our comments are probably only heard by other analysts who would understand them. But yes, I think we can understand some of the actions that get replayed in social, political life, and particularly, well, I've mentioned it, particularly in these more violent political encounters, people actually shooting each other. And this happens all over the world. It isn't just in Israel, is it? You get these shoot-ups in the United States. People go out and shoot up a Muslim, was it? Or the shopping mall or whatever. I think we can comment on these sorts of occurrences and how people do get in states of mind that are not reality-based. They are derived from perhaps the expression of infantile experiences and reactions from very early on. This could be the topic of a whole new conference.
Of course. Okay. Bob, you know, there is a myth that Kleinians enjoy live longer lives than others. What is your secret?
Well, yes, we discussed this earlier. It's entirely from having a Kleinian analysis.